The Harvest Moon's Curse, a true haunting story. You ever feel like the moon's watching you? I know it sounds crazy, but after what happened to me under the harvest moon, I'll never look at it the same way. It all started with a dare. You know, the kind of thing you laugh off with friends until you're standing in the middle of nowhere, wondering why you agreed in the first place. Every fall, the town of Maple Hollow has this local legend about the harvest moon. They say if you go out to the old Miller farm during the full moon, you'll see them, the harvest spirits. Spirits sounds too nice, though. The way my grandma told it, they were more like collectors. Every year they take someone under the harvest moon, she'd say, wagging her finger at me. Don't tempt fate, boy. The land remembers. But who believes that stuff, right? Well, I wish I had. It was me, my cousin Alex, and our friend Emma. We were bored, looking for something spooky to do, and Alex suggested the farm. I bet you're too chicken to go, he said, grinning like a jerk. I'm not scared, I shot back. Famous last words. We drove out there just after sunset, the full moon already high in the sky, glowing this weird orange-red. The farm had been abandoned for decades. The barn was half collapsed. The house was nothing but charred beams. And the fields, they were endless. Rows and rows of dead corn stalks swaying in the wind. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, and way too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. All right, Alex said, pulling out his phone. The dare is simple. Walk through the field to the barn, touch the back wall, and come back. Easy. Emma rolled her eyes. You're both idiots. I'm staying by the car. I wasn't about to back down, though. Fine, let's do it. Alex smirked. See you on the other side, chicken. We stepped into the field together, the corn stalks towering over us. At first, it was just creepy. The kind of creepy that makes your neck tingle and your stomach churn. The moonlight barely reached through the stalks, casting long, twisting shadows. Every step felt like someone, or something, was following us. Did you hear that? I whispered. Alex snorted. Hear what? You're freaking yourself out. But I had heard something, a faint rustling like footsteps, and then we saw it. The barn was silhouetted against the moon, its roof sagging and its walls warped. We're almost there, Alex said, his voice quieter now. The air felt colder as we got closer. The wind picked up, carrying this awful smell, like rotting leaves and wet earth. Something's wrong, I muttered. Alex turned to me, his smirk gone. It's just a story, Jake. Don't be a wimp. But as we stepped into the shadow of the barn, I saw something move. It was faint at first, just a ripple in the moonlight. And then it stepped out of the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were empty sockets, but I swear they were looking at me. Alex, I choked, grabbing his arm. He froze, his eyes locked on the thing. What the hell is that? The figure raised one hand, its fingers long and clawed, and pointed at me. Run! I screamed, yanking Alex back toward the field. We bolted, the corn stalks tearing at our clothes as we stumbled through the rows. But the thing was following us. I could hear it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching closer and closer. Keep going! Alex yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. We burst out of the field and sprinted toward the car. Emma was standing by the door, her face pale. What's wrong? She shouted. Get in the car! Alex screamed. We piled in, slamming the doors just as the figure emerged from the field. It stood at the edge, watching us. The moonlight made it glow, its face twisted into something between a grin and a snarl. And then it started walking toward us. Drive! I yelled. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the road. We didn't stop until we were back in town, parked under the bright lights of a gas station. What the hell was that? Emma demanded, her hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't answer, neither could Alex. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside my window. And when I looked out, the harvest spirit was there, standing under the moonlight, pointing right at me. They say the harvest moon always collects its due. And now, every year, when that orange moon rises, I feel it watching me, waiting to finish what it started. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Pines during the harvest moon, don't go to the farm. Don't tempt fate, because the land remembers. The Harvest Moon's Curse, the Watcher of Hollow Pines. Have you ever felt like something wasn't just wrong, but watching you? Not a person, not an animal, but something far older, far worse. I have. And I'll never forget the night I learned the truth about hollow pines under the harvest moon. It started innocently enough. I'd just moved back to my hometown, a quiet little place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. Hollow Pines was a sleepy village, nestled in a valley surrounded by endless woods. My new house wasn't much, but it was cheap. Too cheap. "Why is it still on the market?" I'd asked the real estate agent. She hesitated, then laughed nervously. "Oh, you know small towns. Rumors and old stories. Folks say the area's cursed." I shrugged it off. I'd heard the whispers growing up too. Legends about the harvest moon and the watcher. But those were just old wives' tales, right? I moved in a week later, right as autumn settled over the valley. The trees blazed red and gold, the nights grew longer, and the townsfolk, well, they acted weird. I'd see them glancing at the sky, muttering prayers under their breath, or nailing herbs to their doors. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But then the moon rose. It was the night of the harvest moon, and the sky was alive with its eerie orange glow. I was unpacking when I heard a knock at the door. An old man stood on my porch, his face weathered like cracked leather. "You're new," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't know the rules." "Rules?" I asked, confused. He glanced over his shoulder at the moonlit woods. "Stay inside, lock your doors, don't look at the trees after dark, and never answer the whispers." I tried to ask what he meant, but he turned and shuffled off into the shadows. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to small-town eccentricity. But as the night went on, I started feeling uneasy. The wind outside picked up, howling like a distant scream. The shadows cast by the moon seemed to stretch and twist, moving even when nothing else did. I shut the blinds, locked the doors, and told myself I was being ridiculous. That's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves. But then it grew louder, words forming in the wind. "Come outside." My chest tightened. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but something about it was wrong. It didn't feel like it was coming from any one place. It was everywhere. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, and then I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves outside. I peered through the blinds, my breath fogging the glass. At first, I didn't see anything, just the moonlight bathing the yard in its orange glow. But then, in the tree line, something moved. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face, oh God, its face. It didn't have eyes, just hollow pits where they should have been. But I knew it saw me. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and hitting the floor hard. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come outside, join the harvest." I scrambled to my feet and locked myself in the bedroom, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. But the call wouldn't go through. The line was dead. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching a baseball bat and praying the thing wouldn't come inside. The footsteps circled the house, slow and deliberate. And then it started knocking. 3 loud bangs on the front door. "Let me in," it whispered. I pressed my back against the wall, tears streaming down my face. The knocks grew louder, more violent. The door rattled on its hinges. And then, silence. I didn't dare move until dawn, when the sunlight finally spilled through the blinds. When I crept outside, the yard was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything being there. But carved into the bark of a tree at the edge of the woods was a single word: soon. I packed up and left Hollow Pines that same day. But every year when the harvest moon rises, I feel it again. That heavy, watching presence. And I know it's waiting. The land remembers, and it always collects. The harvest moon's curse whispers on Blackthorn Hill. Have you ever heard a voice call your name when no one's around? A whisper so soft it brushes the edge of your sanity? I have. And it happened on the night of the harvest moon. Blackthorn Hill was the kind of place locals only talked about in hushed tones, mostly to warn you away. "Stay off that hill," they'd say. "Nothing good ever happens there." I didn't believe them. I was new in town, renting a small farmhouse at the base of the hill. The rent was cheap, the view was stunning, and I liked the quiet. I thought the stories were just superstition. Old folklore about the harvest moon bringing out the spirits of Blackthorn Hill, restless and vengeful. I should have listened. It was a clear autumn evening, the air crisp and cool. I was out on the porch, sipping a beer and admiring the enormous orange moon hanging low over the horizon. Something about it felt unnatural. It bathed the hill in an otherworldly glow, making the blackthorn trees look like twisted, skeletal hands clawing at the sky. And then I heard it. My name. It wasn't loud, just a faint whisper carried on the wind. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Hello?" I called out, but the only response was the rustle of leaves. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Come to me." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was soft and melodic, almost inviting. I stepped off the porch, my pulse racing. My boots crunched on the gravel as I scanned the yard. There was no one there, and yet I felt it. A presence heavy and suffocating, like eyes boring into my back. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check the edge of the woods at the base of the hill. The light carved narrow beams through the darkness, illuminating nothing but gnarled roots and fallen leaves. But as I moved closer to the tree line, the whispering grew louder. "Come closer!" The voice wasn't just in the wind now, it was in my head. I should have turned back. Instead, I climbed the hill. The blackthorn trees seemed to close in around me as I ascended, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a cacophony. Dozens of voices all murmuring the same thing. "Come to me." By the time I reached the top, the moonlight had turned the hilltop into a surreal, glowing landscape. And there, in the center of a clearing, was a single blackthorn tree. It was massive, its branches gnarled and ancient. Hanging from its limbs were strange objects, ribbons, trinkets, even bones. At the base of the tree, the earth was bare, as if nothing could grow there. And then I saw them. Shadows. They moved independently of the trees, flickering and writhing like smoke. They gathered around the tree, forming shapes, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. One of them stepped forward, and my flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, I heard it again. "Come to me." The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and contorting. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then it spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers overlapping. "You should not have come here." I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The shadows surged forward, and for a moment I felt their icy touch, like needles piercing my skin. I don't remember how I made it down the hill. When I came to, I was lying at the edge of the woods, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They followed me home, seeping into my dreams, my thoughts, my soul. Every year when the harvest moon rises, they grow louder, calling me back to Blackthorn Hill. One day I know I'll have to answer. And this time I don't think they'll let me leave. The harvest moon's curse, blood in the orchard. I don't know why I agreed to house sit for my uncle that weekend. Maybe I thought it would be nice to get out of the city, to spend a few days in his quiet farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields and apple orchards. But no one told me about the harvest moon, and no one warned me about the orchard. The first night was peaceful enough. I made myself a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the porch watching the massive orange moon rise over the horizon. The orchard stretched out in neat rows behind the house, a sea of shadows in the moonlight. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches heavy with ripe fruit. It was beautiful, until I noticed the silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. And then, faintly, the laughter started. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, a soft, high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the orchard. I stood up, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. The laughter stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination and went inside, locking the door behind me. The second night was worse. The moon was even brighter, casting an eerie glow over the fields. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I noticed it. One of the apple trees at the edge of the orchard looked different. Its branches were bare, stripped of fruit, and its bark was blackened and twisted. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to get a closer look. The air grew colder as I approached the tree, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. As I got closer, I saw them, deep gouges in the bark, like claw marks, and something strange hanging from the branches. Not apples, bones, small fragile bones tied with bits of red ribbon. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I heard the laughter again. Closer this time. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The orchard was alive with movement. Shadows flickered between the trees, darting from trunk to trunk. And then I saw them. Figures, small and pale with hollow eyes and sharp teeth. They crouched in the branches, their heads tilting unnaturally as they stared at me. One of them spoke, its voice a childlike whisper. "We're hungry." I ran. Branches clawed at my face as I sprinted back to the house, the laughter growing louder behind me. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But the laughter didn't stop. It was coming from inside the house. I crept down the hallway, clutching a knife from the kitchen. The sound was coming from the living room, soft and echoing. The fireplace was cold, but the room was bathed in a faint orange glow. And in the corner, standing in front of the mirror, was a child. Her back was to me, her hair long and matted, her dress torn and dirty. She turned slowly, her face pale and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. The mirror behind her rippled like water and hands, too many hands, reached out, clawing at the edges. The girl stepped closer, her eyes black and empty. "The orchard needs blood," she said, her voice overlapping with the laughter of a dozen other voices. I stumbled back, dropping the knife as the room spun around me. The next thing I remember is waking up outside, the sun rising over the orchard. The tree with the bones was gone, and the laughter was replaced by the chirping of birds. But the marks on my arms told me it wasn't a dream. Long, thin scratches like fingernails etched into my skin. I left that morning and never went back. But every year when the harvest moon rises, I see them in my dreams. Those hollow eyes, that terrible grin. And I know the orchard hasn't forgotten me. The harvest moon's curse whispers in the cornfield. You ever feel like the air itself is watching you? That's how it was that night under the harvest moon. I didn't believe the old stories about cursed land, about the cornfield on the edge of town where folks whispered people disappeared. It was just corn, I thought. Rows of tall stalks swaying in the wind. But that night the air was heavy, thick, like something was pressing against my chest. The moon hung low and red in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the dirt road as I walked past the field. I only took the shortcut because I was running late getting home. I never should have set foot in that field. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on dry dirt and the rustling of the corn as I moved through the rows. At first, it seemed like the moonlight was enough to guide me, but the deeper I went, the darker it got. The stalks grew impossibly tall, towering over me, blotting out the sky. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen was black, dead. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the wind brushing through the corn, but it wasn't the wind. "Turn back." The voice was soft, almost pleading. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just the rustling of the stalks around me. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was imagining things. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping like dozens of voices murmuring just out of reach. The corn began to shift and sway, though there was no wind. And then, ahead of me, I saw a figure. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He stood motionless in the path, his back to me. "Hey," I called out, relief washing over me. "Do you know the way out?" He didn't move. "Sir?" I stepped closer, my hands trembling, and then he turned. His face, God, I'll never forget his face. It was pale, his eyes hollow and empty, his mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. But that wasn't the worst part. His chest was torn open, a gaping hole where his heart should have been. Blood dripped down onto the dirt, but he didn't fall. He just stood there, smiling at me. "It's too late," he whispered. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just knew I had to get out. The corn closed in around me, the stalks twisting and bending, their leaves sharp as blades. The whispers turned to screams, the voices shouting my name. And then I saw them. Figures emerging from the corn, their eyes glowing red in the moonlight, their faces twisted with rage. I stumbled and fell, the ground beneath me damp and sticky. When I looked down, my hands were coated in blood. The dirt was soaked with it, thick and dark, and the air reeked of decay. And then I heard the laughter. Low and guttural, it echoed all around me as the figures closed in. their hands reaching out, their voices chanting something I couldn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the road, the sun rising over the horizon. The cornfield was gone, just an empty patch of land where nothing grew. But my boots were caked with mud and my hands still smelled like blood. I told myself it was a nightmare, a trick of my imagination. But every year when the harvest moon rises, I hear the whispers again. And I know the field is waiting for me. The harvest moon's curse, shadows of the orchard. You ever feel like certain places just remember things? Like the earth itself soaks up the past, holding on to it until someone stirs it awake? That's how my family orchard feels under the harvest moon. I grew up on that land. Acres of apple trees that stretched so far you'd think they touched the sky. During the day, it was beautiful. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, sunlight filtering through the branches. But at night, under the orange glow of the harvest moon, the place was different. My grandma always warned us, never pick apples during the harvest moon. I thought it was just an old wives' tale. I mean, who wouldn't want to harvest under that gorgeous light? The orchard glows, almost golden, magical. But this year we had a deadline. The buyers were coming early and we needed to fill the bins. So I ignored her warning. That was my first mistake. The moon hung so low it felt like you could reach up and touch it. My flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows between the rows of trees. The air was cool, crisp, with just a hint of rot, probably some overripe fruit left on the ground. I was alone out there, or so I thought. The others had called it a night, but I'd been stubborn. I kept hearing my grandma's voice in my head. The orchard remembers. I shook it off, chalking it up to her usual spooky stories. She loved scaring us as kids. Still, something about that night felt off. I had just reached the far edge of the orchard when I noticed it. The apples on those trees were wrong. They looked fine at first glance, but when I held one up to the light, I saw it was blackened on the inside, as if something had rotted it from within. The weird part? The branches were full, too full. Apples hung in unnatural clusters, almost pulsing, like they were alive. I tossed the apple and turned to leave, but then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees creaking. It was a voice. Faint at first, almost drowned out by the rustle of leaves. But it grew louder, clearer, as if someone was standing just behind me. You shouldn't have come here. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing. Just rows of trees stretching endlessly into the dark. Hello? I called, my voice cracking. No response, but the whisper came again, closer this time. I started walking fast. The bins could wait. I just needed to get back to the house. But the path seemed wrong, twisted. The rows of trees didn't line up the way they usually did. It was like the orchard was changing around me, closing in. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. At first, I thought it was one of the workers who'd come back to check on me. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't anyone I recognized. The figure was tall and thin, wearing old tattered clothes that hung off its frame. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was broken. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. It didn't move. I raised my flashlight, the beam flickering weakly, and caught a glimpse of its face. It wasn't a person. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. And its mouth. God, its mouth was too wide, split into a grin that stretched ear to ear, teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered again, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed, coming from all around me. I ran. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching out like hands, snagging at my clothes, scratching my arms. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, turning into a cacophony of voices. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and when I looked up, I saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, their faces twisted, their eyes black pits. They were holding apples, their hands stained with something dark and sticky that dripped onto the ground. "The orchard remembers," they chanted, their voices blending into one. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was surrounded. The next, I was standing in the middle of the dirt road that led back to the house. My clothes were torn, my hands covered in scratches, and the whispers still echoed faintly in my ears. When I looked back, the orchard was still, silent. But the trees, they seemed taller, their branches reaching higher, almost as if they were watching me. I never went back. The buyers came the next day, but they refused to step onto the property. They said the apples were spoiled, rotten to the core. Now every year when the harvest moon rises, I hear the whispers again. And I know the orchard hasn't forgotten. The harvest moon's last light. I was just a kid when it all started. It wasn't anything unusual at first. The harvest moon was rising, big and orange in the sky, and we were at my grandmother's farmhouse, just outside a small town where people still believed in old legends, the kind passed down through generations. Grandma had always been the one to warn me about the strange things that happened around this time of year, but I thought it was just her way of telling spooky stories. You know, the usual stuff. Stories about the cursed woods near the edge of her property, the ghostly figure that appeared in the garden at dusk, and how the harvest moon always seemed to bring something dark, something evil, out of hiding. But I didn't believe her. That night, after we finished dinner and the dishes were cleared, my cousin and I decided to venture into the old orchard behind the house. It was a place where the trees were so twisted they looked like they were reaching for you. As kids, we'd always dared each other to wander deeper into it, to touch the old stone well at the far edge, where Grandma said no one should go after dark. We were standing under the harvest moon, the air cool and crisp, when I saw something strange in the distance, a shadow. But it wasn't like any shadow I had ever seen before. It was too tall, too wide. I could barely make it out, but it was moving. "Did you see that?" I whispered to my cousin, who was already staring wide-eyed toward the darkened tree line. She nodded but didn't say anything. My heart started pounding in my chest. It was probably just a deer or maybe some raccoons, I told myself. The stories my grandmother told me were nothing but nonsense after all. But then I heard it, a soft rustling like footsteps coming from behind us. I spun around, but the orchard was still, empty. "You heard that too, right?" I asked her, trying to stay calm. She didn't respond. Her face had gone pale and her eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned, my pulse racing, but I couldn't see anything. The trees were still, silent. A strange, cold breeze swept through the orchard, carrying the scent of rotting fruit and damp earth. It was then that I noticed something else, something moving near the stone well. There was a shape, crouched low to the ground, just out of reach of the moon's light. The shadow didn't match the shape of any animal I'd seen before. "Let's go back," I said. But as I turned to walk toward the house, my cousin stayed frozen in place. I reached out for her arm, but she pulled away. Her eyes were wide, staring into the darkness like she was trapped in some kind of trance. I think it's coming closer," she muttered, barely audible. I grabbed her hand, tugging hard, but it was like pulling on a stone. Her body was stiff, unyielding. Her breath came out in sharp gasps, and for the first time in my life, I saw true fear in her eyes. I turned, ready to run, but as I did, I saw it, the shape from the well moving toward us. It was no longer crouched, it was standing tall. The moonlight caught it in a way that made it seem like it had no right to exist. It was humanoid, but distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to melt in and out of focus, like smoke in the night air. Before I could even scream, the air around us turned thick and oppressive. The moonlight flickered, like the light was struggling to shine through some unseen barrier. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I could hear whispers. Low, guttural whispers coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, the coldness of it, was enough to freeze my blood. And then it spoke, not in words, but in feelings. The thing was hungry. I don't know how we managed to make it back to the house, but somehow we did. We ran, stumbling through the orchard, with the thing, whatever it was, right behind us. The whispers grew louder, and I swear I could feel its breath on the back of my neck as we sprinted for the safety of the farmhouse. When we finally slammed the door shut behind us, panting and terrified, Grandma was already standing there, as if waiting for us. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. "The harvest moon's curse," she said softly, almost as if she was relieved. "It's that time again." I didn't understand what she meant until years later, after I'd grown up and moved away. The nightmares kept coming, even when I was far from that orchard. The thing never left. I could still hear those whispers, still feel the coldness creeping into my bones. It was only then that I realized what Grandma had been trying to protect us from all along. The harvest moon doesn't just bring light, it brings the dark things that have been hiding in the shadows, waiting for this time of year. And once they find you, once they know you're marked, there's no escaping them. It's been years, but I can still feel its eyes watching me, even now. When the harvest moon rises, I know it's coming back for me. And I can't run anymore. Never look away from the harvest moon.